Hello everyone, I'm talking today about the topic of political districting. Interestingly enough, I'm here end of October from the United States, and as we know, in 2020 there is a big election coming. So I felt it was an interesting time to discuss this particular topic. Okay, it is for geographer, it is a very important topic because of course we are going to discuss how we define districts, political districts, and which sort of measures we can take to define or come up with districts that are of equal population, guarantee a certain racial diversity or balance if you wish, and a few other criteria. So I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in many countries, and so especially in the US, every so often boundaries can be redrawn. And this is particularly the case when the census is conducted, which is every 10 years. Okay, so this is a time where politicians may decide to redraw the boundaries of their district to their advantage. Now, there are a few definitions that are important here in the topic of political districting. The first one is reapportionment, which is essentially allocating electoral seats to territories such as seats to states. So, for instance, we know very well that there will be a count in the census in 2020, and that will essentially define how many seats California will get, North Carolina will get, Vermont will get, and so on and so forth. And we saw this was a very political topic. Now, second is the concept of, or the definition of, about redistricting. And this is a process by which we redefine territorial district. Now, this is not just for political purpose. You have also other type of districts, such as a fire district or a school attendance zone. Now, you don't have to wait the census every 10 years to redefine or to do redistricting on fire or school, of course. But you want to try to get some good population estimates. We have something that is called malapportionment, which is essentially the inequality in population size of districts. Okay, so generally, as you will see later on, this is something that we're trying to avoid. But you could have districts that have a lower population than others, and you could argue then why I don't get as many representatives for my district. And then, of course, the topic of today is gerrymandering, which is the manipulation of boundaries for political purposes. Okay, the way I will proceed here is that next I would like to show you some example of gerrymandered district in the United States to get sort of the ball rolling here. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanism, or how do we define political districts. And that would sort of help us to then understand what mechanism exists to gerrymander some district, right? We'll talk about dilution, packing, and other of those techniques. And then finally, we'll go into the formulation that is used, and I think that was proposed by Garfinkel and Namhauser, I think, that sort of follows a P-median approach. You will see that in gerrymandering or political district in general, there are some geographic relationships that we discussed earlier that are very important, such as compactness or spatial contiguity, right? And a few others, like distance. We're trying to minimize distance, for instance. So without any further delay, let's go to our second topic for tonight, which is I'm going to give some examples of gerrymandering. I will show a few examples from North Carolina, Illinois, and Texas. First example here is the one for North Carolina 12 congressional district that stretched from northern Mecklenburg County to Greensboro, and you can see the shape is very elongated. Here you can see in North Carolina the former and new congressional district after 2018. Another example is Congressional District 10 of North Carolina, where Asheville is essentially diluted within another congressional district. The new congressional district for 2020 will do a better representation for Democrats and Republicans. Note how Asheville is not diluted anymore. Another example is Texas 35 congressional district that is stretched very far from Austin to San Antonio. And the last example is Illinois 4th congressional district that it looks like an earmuff, packing Hispanic population into a single district. Okay, before we move on into how gerrymandering is actually conducted, I felt it was important that we discuss a few of the terminology. So first off, we talked about political district, and really that really can be defined as a subdivision of a territory. Again, you have a geographic area and you can subdivide it into a fixed number of districts, right? So I think for North Carolina, for instance, you may have 18 or I don't know, maybe 14, I forgot the exact number, in which an election is conducted. So in other words, there is actually a certain number of seats that is going to be established for that particular state, for instance, based on its population. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Now, if we really want it to be fair, right, a district, so a political district, should be nurtured, so no political party should be able to take advantage from the subdivision, right? But that's difficult to say because, of course, people may change their mind when there is an election coming, and they may, like in the US, flip from one party to another party. And think, for instance, if you were to try to do this in Europe or in other countries where you have more than just two parties, you have multiple parties, it would be very, very challenging to do it. And, this political party should try to avoid take advantage to gain seat, and this is a process of gerrymandering that we will talk about a little bit later. Again, more from how to go about doing it. And then it's very important when we talk about political district to pay attention to both the size, which is essentially the number of residents, as well as the shape of the district. So there comes, of course, a lot of criteria from a GIS perspective or a geographic perspective. What do we mean by the size? And what do we mean by the shape? Okay, well, the size, like I said, relatively straightforward by the number of residents, but still, okay, you may have extremely large districts that go and encompass many, many counties, while you may have a district, right, that just is a few census block groups, right? So let's think about this as we're moving forward. Okay, I would like to now go over the criteria for political redistricting. Many of these come from this book. I hope you can see it, from Richard Murray, who was a faculty member at the University of Washington. Now let's talk about 4 different kinds here, and of course you will see that some are more relevant to our class. Okay, first are constitutional criteria. So as I have hinted about this earlier, you may have a criteria that is about the equality of the population. So in other words, every district, when we're talking about political district, of course, should have about the same size in terms of population. Now, if you were talking about, let's say, school district, that would be different because that may actually be dictated by the size of the school. So you may have larger district when you have a larger school, for instance. And then each of these districts should have a certain balance in terms of racial equality. Okay, that's something that is not always easy to incorporate in the optimization of this district, but that is something that is, of course, very important, and in the United States has gone to the Supreme Court many times. Second are geographic criteria. We have talked a little bit about compactness when we talked about the p-median, and you will see this is one of the models that is used. And contiguity, and I'd like to draw your attention on contiguity here, because here this may form a district, but actually this is not a valid district because this district is made out of 2 parts here, and they are not adjacent to one another. Okay. While in this case, this actually would possibly work. Okay. Now, in terms of geographic criteria, there is something that is quite relevant, right? It could be that you have a district that does not actually look very compact strictly from an Euclidean space. And I'm going to just draw a small example so you can better understand. And we oftentimes think, on this side here, that this would be a very compact, right, type of district. Well, if you were using, let's say, travel time, and this was a main highway that was actually crossing your district, right? So your district may look more, you know, maybe something like this. I'm not quite sure. You know, maybe something like this. Close here. Because we're not then trying to minimize the distance, but we're trying to minimize the travel time. And quite frankly, if you had here is kind of the center of your political district, and if you had to travel there to vote, well, that would be probably make a lot of sense, okay? That the district would be sort of elongated, and there are many cases that look like that. Okay, sorry about that. So now let's go into the other criteria. You have the political geographic criteria, where you want to try actually to have a certain representation of political units when it's possible, and also an integrity of political boundaries. Now, what does that mean? In practice, that means that if you say you live in the United States, if you live in a county, for instance, and then that your county is split, and so I'm taking an example here, you have a county here. Now, if your county is split into two, right, it's sort of, first it might be difficult to actually know who is your representative, but oftentimes, you know, you sort of identify yourself in a county, right? So there are so many services in a county, like libraries, right? Like maybe swimming pools, right? Maybe parks. There are so many services that are available within the county, and when it's separated into two, that is a little bit difficult in that stage. And that may happen, right? That you do need to split some counties or maybe other units so that you actually reach an equal population. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that some of these criteria here, right, if you need to guarantee those criteria, well, they may come at the cost of this criteria here. And then from a political perspective, there are political criteria as well. There is also little purpose as altering a lot of changes to the existing system. So what I mean is that if you every 4 years or every 2 years, right, you have a new, you change the boundaries, right, then you have, essentially you don't really know who your representative is anymore. And you do need to have some homogeneity there, okay? And you know, another criteria, of course, is political gerrymandering, and that is something that we're going to talk about its mechanism now. Alright, as promised, I'm going to explain a little bit how to gerrymander, right? There is actually a very important political operative who died, who has been instrumental in how to gerrymander for the Republican Party, and I'll talk about this maybe a little bit later. But the name gerrymander actually is coming from the governor Gerry of Massachusetts. And back in 1812, so this is actually a long time ago, he was trying to maximize the election of the Republican and Democrats. At that time they were together against the Federalists. Now, at that time, the Republican and the Democrats got 29 seats and the Federalists got 11 seats, but the Federalists actually won the popular vote. Now, that seems a very big margin, but something like this is not very uncommon. Like in North Carolina, it could well be that the Democrats won the election from a popular vote, but they have much lower number of seats. Now, let's look at the sort of two approaches that exist to gerrymander. I mean, there are other techniques, but those I think are the two major one. Okay. So on the left hand side you have a scenario of what is called dilution. Okay, so what is that, right? So in this particular instance, we have about, let's say, I'm just for a sake here, 400 individuals. Okay, we do have here we have 160 Democrats, right, and we have 200 apologize, 40 Republicans. Okay, so if you look at this, 160 Democrats, 240 Republicans, you could argue, okay, there could be maybe 1 seat for Democrats, maybe 3 seats for Republican. Okay, that would kind of make sense, but it could flip back and forth. No, so let's look here how we go about gerrymandering here. So the way we would try to draw, of course, this is a schematic, we would try to draw our boundaries in a way that the Democrats are diluted. So in this case, this may form maybe 1 district, right? 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats. This one here would form another district, district number 2, 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats. District number 3, 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats, and the same thing here for district number 4. In these particular examples, Democrats have absolutely no chance to win a seat, okay, through dilution. No, I'm not taking Democrats versus Republican. They could have just switched the letters. Okay, so we're going to look at another one called packing. So let's have a quick look here. How many Democrats do we have in this example? So we have 100, so we have 220 Democrats. Okay, and then we have 60, 60, and 60, so we have 180 Republicans. Now, when I look here again, I could argue that the majority is that we have Democrats, 220 versus 180 Republicans. So my take would be 2 seats Democrats, 2 seats Republican, based on the equal equal population. Remember those different criteria we talked about earlier. Well, there is no way here, I mean it would be very difficult here to do a dilution, right? Because really the majority here is Democrat. So instead what we could do is to create a district here that is almost purely Democrat, right? So that's called packing. So we're packing all the Democrats here, the example, all the Democrats within one district, and then afterwards we kind of sort of diluting the rest, right? But so this would form here another district. This one here forms district number 2. Okay, so that's district number 2 here. Okay, take another color to make things a little bit easier. This here would form district, see, district number 3, and then let's take another color again to form here district number 4. Okay, and you can see that district number 2, 3, and 4 all have a majority of Republicans, and so the Republicans here have eventually 3 seats versus Democrats who have 2 seats. Now, there are of course other techniques, and if you actually looked at the different videos that I suggested to look at, you could really see how things happen. Now, this is just based on the party affiliation. But so what if you have racial differences or different ethnicities? How can you reconcile? And this is becoming extremely difficult, of course, because sometimes at the Supreme Courts, some districts were deemed, it was not about the political affiliation, but were deemed racially, they were not representing the different racial groups. Okay, so think how this can actually really become an optimization problem for either Republican or Democrat or another party representative. So what I'd like to spend a little bit of time now is on the formulation and how we would go about formulating a political districting problem. Alright, as we're trying to move to the formulation, I think it's important to draw your attention to different metrics that have been used to try to explain this gerrymandering, right? So here I have an example where I have a political district. Here you can see this is in white, and I have also drawn here this the circle that can encompass this political district. Okay, we have a minimum and we have also a maximum distance, right? That separates 2 sides of the district. and those are the two sort of extreme side of the district. There is a geographer that's very popular, unfortunately I believe he passed away, Bungie, and he has done a lot of work to try to characterize shapes as it relates to geographic regions. So one of them is to measure the perimeter divided by the circumference. So the perimeter would be the length here, right? The sum of the length divided by the circumference of the circle. Anytime it goes beyond 1.67, then we would say this is an irregular district. The second one would be the maximum diameter divided by the minimum diameter, another approach. The third one would be the area of the district divided by the circumscribed circle, and the fourth one would be what is called the moment of inertia, which is essentially the distance from the centroid. Okay, but here again, remember, as we mentioned earlier, about the distance to the centroid, you may have a district that is quite elongated because maybe you happen to have a highway that passed through that across your district, and then the distances to the center are generally dictated by this highway that crosses to your district. Anyways, long story short, we're most likely going to use a p-median to try to address this number 4, which is the moment of inertia, and this is what is used quite a bit. Okay, as promised, I want to go over the formulation for the political districting problem. So this is quite similar to a p-median. However, I'd like to draw your attention on a little bit of a difference here, which is xij, and xij is actually an unknown, and that's what I'm trying to define is how much of the population is going to be assigned from geographic unit I, so the I represent geographic units like census blocks, census tracts, whatever level we are using, to J, and J here is the political district or congressional district, for instance. Okay, there are a couple of interesting constraints. The first constraint here says that for each geographical unit, like let's say now a census block, for instance, right? If I sum up over all the J's, then and all the J's where that geographical unit may have been split and sent to, that should be equal to the population at I. So the example that I provide here is that I have a geographical unit here I have 3 districts, 1, 2, and 3, and if I sum up each part here, right, that is kind of been split, right, then that should be equal to the population at I. Similarly here, for each congressional district J here, if I sum up all the populations of all of the geographical units that are being assigned to that particular congressional unit, then that summing over all the I's, that should be equal to that population within that congressional unit, right? So for instance, we'll say, well, there will be 10,000 in this congressional unit, 10,000 here, 10,000 here, and so on and so forth. So briefly here, that constraint, right, is to say Q sub J, so the population there should be equal to Q sub J here, that all the summations here divided by M, and all the population divided by M. And this is this last constraint is to really guarantee that the congressional districts are not, let's say one is 25,000, the other one is maybe 2,000, the other one is maybe, no, we're trying to reach, you know, with certain bound, a certain similarity in terms of population. So equal population, remember, that was one of the criteria for political districting. Okay, so I hope this is useful, right? We have seen now gerrymandering and political districting, how it came about, how we go about doing it. I show you some example and on the formulation. And again, I hope this is useful for your overall knowledge on the topic.